When you think of Henry VIII children, you likely picture the ruthless Bloody Mary or the glorious Elizabeth I. But there was another child, one whose brief reign revealed a darkness that even his notorious father might have found unsettling. Edward VI, the boy king who inherited the throne at 9, transformed from a seemingly innocent child into one of England's most authoritarian rulers before meeting an end so twisted it would haunt the Tudor dynasty forever. This story isn't just about a sick boy dying young, it's about how absolute power corrupts absolutely, even in a child's hands. What you'll discover about Edward's final days will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Tudor legacy. When you think of Henry VIII children, you likely picture the ruthless Bloody Mary or the glorious Elizabeth I. But there was another child, one whose brief reign revealed a darkness that even his notorious father might have found unsettling. Edward VI, the boy king who inherited the throne at 9, transformed from a seemingly innocent child into one of England's most authoritarian rulers before meeting an end so twisted it would haunt the Tudor dynasty forever. This story isn't just about a sick boy dying young, it's about how absolute power corrupts absolutely, even in a child's hands. What you'll discover about Edward's final days will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Tudor legacy. In autumn 1547, England found itself ruled by a 9-year-old boy who believed he was God's chosen instrument on earth. Edward VI ascended the throne after Henry VIII's death, inheriting a kingdom torn by religious upheaval. Molded by radical Protestant tutors, Edward had been raised to see himself as destined for greatness, sheltered from the harsh realities his sisters endured. This combination of divine authority and childish petulance proved deadly for thousands of his subjects. The England Edward inherited was a powder keg of religious tension. His father had broken with Rome, establishing the Church of England, but the country remained divided between Catholics, moderate Protestants, and radical reformers. Edward's Regency Council, led by his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, initially promised moderate governance. However, the young king had his own ideas. From his first council meetings, Edward displayed an unsettling mix of childish petulance and cold calculation, interrupting experienced advisors to lecture them on Protestant doctrine. Within weeks of his coronation, he was personally reviewing death sentences, showing disturbing enthusiasm for executing those he deemed heretical. Court records reveal a child who treated matters of life and death like intellectual exercises, debating theological justifications for punishments with the same detachment he might discuss Latin grammar. Witnesses reported Edward smiling when signing death warrants, apparently pleased with his own cleverness in finding scriptural justification for each execution. His early months were marked by what courtiers privately called religious tantrums, explosive fits of rage whenever anyone suggested moderation in religious policy. Edward believed any compromise with Catholic practices was a personal betrayal of Christ. When an advisor suggested allowing some Catholic nobles to continue private worship, Edward reportedly threw his inkwell at the man and screamed that God would punish England for such weakness. These incidents, initially dismissed as childish behavior, revealed a dangerous religious fanatic forming. Perhaps most disturbing was Edward's lack of normal childish interests. While other 9-year-olds played with toys, Edward read accounts of the Spanish Inquisition, taking detailed notes on interrogation techniques. His servants found drawings in his chamber depicting torture methods, annotated with his commentary on their effectiveness for extracting confessions from heretics. The boy who should have been learning to ride horses was instead studying how to break human bodies and spirits in service of his Protestant vision. What made Edward particularly dangerous was his combination of religious fanaticism and royal authority. While his advisors plotted around him, Edward absorbed every lesson about the divine right of kings with terrifying enthusiasm. His detailed journals reveal a child who delighted in descriptions of executions, religious persecutions, and the suffering of those he deemed heretics. By age 10, he was composing sermons delivered in churches across England, calling for the complete elimination of Catholic influence and promising divine punishment for anyone showing mercy to heretics. Edward's cruelty wasn't limited to religious matters. He demonstrated a vindictive streak that shocked even hardened courtiers who had served his ruthless father. When servants displeased him, Edward devised elaborate punishments designed to humiliate rather than correct. One page who spilled wine on Edward's papers was forced to stand in the courtyard for hours while courtiers threw rotten food at him, all at the 11-year-old king's direction. Edward watched these humiliations with pleasure, taking notes on the victims' reactions as if conducting scientific experiments. His journal entries reveal a mind increasingly detached from human emotion. Edward wrote about others suffering with clinical detachment, noting details of pain and fear as interesting observations rather than tragedies. When a kitchen maid died after being flogged on his orders for allegedly practicing Catholic prayers, his only comment was that the correction proved more effective than anticipated in removing the subject from further error. Edward's treatment of his family showed his growing sociopathy. Despite being raised alongside his sisters in early childhood, he showed no affection for Mary or Elizabeth once he assumed the throne. He viewed Mary, a devout Catholic, as a dangerous threat to be controlled or eliminated, and Elizabeth as a potential ally only because of her Protestant sympathies. Family relationships were purely political calculations. When his uncle Thomas Seymour tried to gain influence through gifts and flattery, Edward saw it as manipulation. When Thomas was arrested for treason, Edward supported his execution and reportedly watched emotionlessly from his window as the axe fell, making notes on the effectiveness of different execution methods. As Edward entered his 12th year, his authoritarian tendencies intensified. The once frail, bookish boy began asserting direct control over government policy, overruling advisors he deemed too lenient. His Protestant reforms grew increasingly draconian, with mandatory church attendance enforced by informants and severe penalties for any deviation from approved doctrine. Edward designed a system of religious surveillance that would have made the Spanish Inquisition proud, encouraging neighbors to spy on each other and rewarding children for reporting their parents' religious transgressions. The king issued detailed regulations governing public worship and private devotions, dictating how subjects should pray, what they should believe, and even how they should think about God. Violations were treated as treason against crown and deity, with punishments escalating from public humiliation to imprisonment to death. Edward personally reviewed every case, often increasing recommended punishments for insufficient zeal. His court became a place where paranoia and fanaticism were rewarded, and mercy was seen as weakness. Edward's persecution combined childish creativity with deadly intent. When traditional punishments seemed insufficient, he invented new forms of humiliation and suffering, always justified by theological arguments. One Catholic priest who refused to renounce his faith was forced to carry a sign reading, "Enemy of Christ," through London streets while children threw stones at him, all at Edward's direction. The king watched from his palace window, reportedly laughing at the priest's suffering while dictating observations to his secretary. Edward's obsession with religious purity extended to his family, revealing his complete lack of natural affection. He viewed his half-sister Mary not as family but as the greatest threat to his Protestant England. In private letters, he referred to her as the bastard and Christ's enemy, plotting to have her declared illegitimate or executed for heresy. His hatred for Mary was both childish and chilling, consuming him with a personal intensity that worried even his radical advisors. Edward spent hours devising scenarios for Mary's arrest, trial, and execution, drafting detailed charges of heresy and treason. He even wrote a confession for Mary, forcing her to renounce Catholicism and acknowledge her illegitimacy before a merciful beheading rather than burning. His treatment of Elizabeth was more complex but equally disturbing. While he approved of her Protestant beliefs, he saw her primarily as a tool for his religious agenda, planning to use her marriage to cement Protestant alliances. Her future happiness was irrelevant compared to the political advantages her marriage might bring. Edward's inability to form normal family relationships extended to his broader court. He treated nobles, advisors, and servants as pieces on a chessboard, to be moved according to his religious and political strategies. Loyalty meant complete submission to his vision, with no room for personal conscience. When Edward began showing signs of serious illness in early 1553, his behavior grew even more erratic and cruel. Rather than softening in the face of mortality, the 15-year-old king became obsessed with ensuring his Protestant reforms would survive his death. The possibility of Mary's accession and a Catholic restoration drove him to desperate measures. His declining health intensified his extremism, as if he were trying to compress a lifetime of Protestant purification into his remaining months. Court physicians reported that Edward's illness, likely a combination of tuberculosis and possible arsenic poisoning from misguided treatments, was accompanied by fevered preaching. He delivered rambling sermons about eliminating Catholic influence, even if it meant killing every Catholic in England. These rants, initially dismissed as delirium, reflected his genuine intentions. Edward began secretly meeting with Protestant extremists, plotting a coup to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. The conspiracy was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty, involving plans to arrest or kill both sisters and install a puppet regime controlled by Protestant fanatics. Edward, despite his physical weakness, threw himself into these planning sessions with terrifying energy. Working with John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, he crafted a plan for mass executions of Catholic nobles, the seizure of Catholic properties, and the establishment of a permanent religious police force. His shaky handwriting filled pages with plans for what amounted to religious genocide. Edward's illness had a cruel twist that seemed like divine retribution. Modern analysis suggests he suffered from tuberculosis and arsenic poisoning, possibly administered by physicians trying to save him. The king who had poisoned England with religious hatred was himself being slowly poisoned. As his body deteriorated, Edward experienced hallucinations and periods of madness, interpreted by courtiers as religious visions. His suffering intensified his fervor, feeding his mental obsessions rather than purifying them. Court physicians recorded that Edward's body began emitting a foul odor weeks before his death, his skin turning greenish from poisoning. His hair and fingernails fell out, and he suffered violent convulsions that left him temporarily paralyzed. The once beautiful prince became a grotesque shadow of himself, his body rebelling against the poison killing him. Yet he remained lucid enough to understand his fate, alternating between screams of agony and rants about Protestant martyrs. His last conversations were not about reconciliation but regret that he wouldn't live to complete his purification of England. His final words, cursing Mary and praying for Protestant England, were a fitting end to a life consumed by fanaticism. When Edward died on July 6, 1553, the relief among his courtiers was palpable, though few expressed it openly. The boy king who promised salvation had become a nightmare, and his death offered escape from policies driving England toward civil war. His conspiracy collapsed within days, as moderate Protestants abandoned the extremist plot. Lady Jane Grey, the intended beneficiary, found herself friendless as nobles distanced themselves. Mary's successful claim to the throne was supported by Catholics and moderate Protestants horrified by Edward's reign. The irony of Edward's story is profound. The king obsessed with eliminating Catholic influence strengthened it through his extremism. His persecution of moderate Protestants left English Protestantism dominated by fanatics, repelling ordinary believers. Many began viewing Catholicism as a refuge from Edward's harsh demands. Modern historians reveal a young man genuinely enthusiastic about persecution, showing disturbing signs of enjoying others' suffering. His journals, documenting torture methods and executions, suggest England was ruled for 6 years by a child psychopath with unlimited power. Edward's transformation from innocent child to cruel tyrant offers insights into the corrupting nature of absolute power. His isolation and belief in his divine authority created a perfect storm of cruelty. Unlike adult rulers with some capacity for empathy, Edward's complete belief that opposition was sinful made him capable of atrocities that shocked the violent Tudor age. His courtiers, frightened by his behavior, were powerless to restrain him, as his divine right doctrine made opposition blasphemy. Had Edward lived to adulthood, his plans for a permanent religious police force, elimination of Catholic nobility, and surveillance state could have created one of history's most oppressive regimes. His death may have been England's greatest mercy, sparing it from the full flowering of his terrible vision. Edward VI's brief reign stands as a warning about the dangers of combining absolute authority with ideological certainty, especially in someone too young to understand the consequences. The boy who should have been playing with toys was planning mass executions, treating human lives as expendable in his quest for religious purity. His story illuminates the dangerous intersection of youth, power, and ideology, showing how good intentions can be corrupted into something monstrous.